Okay, so Zone 3 Podcast, we are in Jacksonville. We're at the Wolfson Center, the Children's Hospital. We are with John Posh. John, you are a legend. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I'm just going to tell you something about it. Like, how'd you start in MRI? Kids, wife, where you from? All those.
Married, 3 kids, live in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, happily. Nice, quiet town.
Nice.
Very nice, rural. Lots of open space and grass.
Yeah, you're on like an acre and a half, you said, right?
Yeah. Nice open yard.
So a lot
Need some greens.
A lot of lawn mowing.
A lot of lawn mowing. Fortunately, you can pay people to do that these days.
I love mowing a lawn. You know, it's therapeutic.
I used to when I was younger, but you get older, you got other commitments. It's easier to let someone else do it.
I mean, that's what you have kids for, right?
Especially the weed whacker,
Right.
it's just, that gets old.
No, that part's no fun. But okay.
Yeah,
Well, we're
it's
talking about stuff today that's kind of fun. Actually, it's an interesting story or background that you have. So you started in MRI, but you started in radiology, what, back in the 80s?
So I went to X-ray school from 85 to 87.
Okay.
And I knew when I got into X-ray school by the second year, I really didn't want to do X-ray for my career. But there weren't a lot of options back then. It was ultrasound nuclear medicine. So there was an MRI program that was just starting up at Johns Hopkins. So I applied to that, and it was, it's where it all started for me.
Nice.
And then so once you got into MRI, what was kind of the career path there?
So it's been everywhere. It's been all over the map. I started as a clinical tech, clinical lead, manager, and I've been in a bunch of managerial roles in industry for vendors, sales support, training and education, pretty much every role you can have except for sales. I've never actually sold anything.
Well, you're really good at selling. You're very persuasive.
Yeah, but I don't like it's something about the need to sell. Like you have to ask people for money. It's never been my thing.
Me neither.
If somebody wants to buy something and they want to come give me a check, I'll sell it. But I'm not going to ask them for the check to sell it.
Right.
It's kind of just a feeling I have. And I've always felt my talents lied elsewhere anyway.
Well, I mentioned you have a very interesting background, and I think it kind of started in forensics, right?
So it started off, when I was first in MRI in Maryland, there was a bunch of researchers who were looking for after-hours scan support for techs. They were looking for techs who would scan for them. They were doing research projects on any number of things. Some of it was animal specimens. One of them was trays of clams. They were looking at the development of clams in different environments of water.
What sequences do you run for that?
Well, in the 80s, there was 2. There was spin echo or gradient echo. So it didn't really matter. You had 2 choices.
Right.
So you ran both.
Yeah.
And it expanded into other things. There was some porpoises, some sea lions, some larger specimens. It was a shark. But there was really sort of scattered and late at night and one-offs. The cool stuff happened in the early 90s. I'd say it was 1992 probably that there was a crime in Philadelphia, and the police were engaged in a shootout with the suspect. The suspect died of his gunshot wounds. And at some point a few days later, the medical examiner came over and said, "Can you help us with something? We're x-raying this guy's brain. We know he was shot in the brain, in the head. It was a fatal gunshot, but we can't find fragments of the bullet on x-ray. Is MRI sensitive enough to find metal fragments?" And of course, we talked about it because it was something that no one has been doing. I mean, no one had done. So I got to the medical director and we sat down and we said, yes, we think we can do this for several reasons. When the bullet goes into the tissue, it's going to flake off pieces of metal at the microscopic level, which we can see. The bullets are generally non-magnetic, so we don't think there's a safety concern. And there's also going to be air introduced, and the air itself will act as a susceptibility agent.
Nice.
So he said, okay. So he brought us the brain in a plastic bucket with no handles and no metal.
Right.
We scanned it in all directions with all sequences we could muster at the time, and we couldn't find bullet fragments. So X-ray couldn't find them, MRI couldn't find them. Turns out they brought us the wrong brain. So they brought us a normal brain that wasn't shot.
Forensics 101.
Forensics 101. Bring the right brain. But it gave us an interesting thought. So the medical examiner at the time said, but your theory is that you could follow the track of a bullet through tissue. And we said, yes, we can. So we decided to try it as a research project. So we developed this the protocol that we were going to scan a pot roast that was shot with a bullet, and then we were going to see if we could follow the trajectory of the bullet to the pot roast. The problem is discharging a firearm in the city of Philadelphia requires approval from Congress. We had to go to ATF. We had to go to the Justice Department. We had to go to the Philadelphia Police Department. And finally, it was decided the only person who was legally qualified and capable of shooting a pot roast in the city of Philadelphia was the firearms instructor at the police academy.
That's funny.
So we took it down to the Navy shipyards where the bullet would do no damage, shot a pot roast for us, and we scanned it.
What was the caliber
Sure
of the
enough,
bullet?
I don't know.
Okay.
Good question. Probably 45, whatever they were carrying at the time.
Yeah.
Right.
That was probably the Colt 45 years.
Dang.
So we were able to do it. So then we decided, let's go to the next phase. So we got a science grant to study post-mortem gunshot wounds to the brain, to the head and body in 38 cadavers. And we also said at the same time there was a co-project going on for SIDS, for shaken baby syndrome, versus sudden infant death. They sometimes can't tell them apart, except on autopsy. The problem is, on autopsy, when you open the tissues, you introduce blood and air into the tissues. One of the hallmarks of shaken baby is blood in the optic nerve, because the brain stretches the optic nerve, and the optic nerve hemorrhages. Well, you can't really see that all the time when you cut them open, or you couldn't at the time. Forensics has gotten much better now. So we scanned a bunch of adults who were shot in the head or the chest with MRI and CT. We tracked the trajectory of the bullets, and we were able to reconstruct bullet pathways, and it was a total success. The problem was we were never able to publish it because at the time there was a scandal in the medical examiner's office involving some improprieties or alleged improprieties, and so we were sort of embargoed from publishing the data. We could publish it now, but 30 years later, I don't know that I have the energy to go back and publish something we did 30 years ago.
Right.
But I do have all the images and all the data. I'll share a picture or two with you. Nothing gory, just MRIs.
Right.
So was this for the purpose of going to court?
So forensic MRI hadn't passed something called the Dauber test at the time. And the Dauber test is the test of validity to make it a reliable evidence
Right.
for testimony in court. And MRI hadn't passed that test yet. So it wasn't usable in court. But it was just one of those things that can we, will we, should we? And at the time, everyone said it doesn't work. So we, of course, never believed that. And every time someone says it doesn't work, I'm doing it twice.
Right.
For fun.
I think I just figured out how to get you to do karaoke tonight.
That's not going to work. Nice try, though. That won't work. But so we did present the data. So we weren't allowed to publish it, but we did present it at conferences, and we presented it at tech meetings and stuff.
Right.
The first ISMRM meeting, we presented it there.
Where was it?
I think it was New York.
Okay. Nice.
The timeline's fuzzy back then because it's 35 years ago.
Right.
And I've been to so many meetings since that they all sort of start to blur. But I think it was New York when we presented it, and it sort of generated interest. And then we started getting phone calls from people saying, "Hey, I heard you presented on this." In the interim, after that, I started scanning everything. Like I was always scanning weird things. We scanned one of the guys brought
Nice dream.
one of the guys brought a hoagie for lunch. So we scanned his hoagie just for fun. See if we could tell what the layers were.
Right.
So I was scanning fruits and vegetables and flowers. Like I'd find a flower on the side of the road. I take the flower, keep it in water, and scan it.
Yeah.
And it's really cool because you use a thick slice and you just do a single slice and you get a flower. Wow. It actually works really quite well. We saved our used gadolinium syringes, our vials, and we were injecting it into. So we had a tree outside my house that grew these horse chestnuts.
Uh-huh.
So I cut one off way back on the stem, and it was just developing. I put an IV tube on it, and we injected in the normal water there. We injected a little bit of gadolinium, and we could see the gadolinium perfusing the nut as it aged over time. It was very cool stuff. And because of all this stuff, we sort of had this reputation for doing weird things. So a friend of mine, who's now become a very good friend, it was a casual acquaintance at the time from Connecticut. He was associated with Quinnipiac University. And he said, "You think we could scan a mummy?" And I said, "Well, it depends on the mummy."
Like a mommy or a mummy?
A mummy.
Okay.
We've scanned lots of mummies. Mummies are easy to scan. Just got to get them to hold still. Mummies hold still on their own. So the first real mummy specimen that we did was a Peruvian mummy, and it was 1995 maybe. And it was a woman who was in the fetal position. She was very contracted, and she was completely dry. She weighed 11 pounds. So they said, this isn't going to work. There's no water.
And what time era was she from?
She was from Peru approximately 1,000 years ago.
Okay.
So different civilizations practice mummification in different time periods.
Right.
The South Americans have been doing it longer than anybody, including the Egyptians. They started like 7,000 years ago. So they said, everyone said, this isn't going to work. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of time. And it was initially. Like we put the mummy in the head coil. We put the mummy in the body coil. We tried the flex coils. We tried everything we could.
Right.
Couldn't get signal. Turns out we had to trick the scanner. So we developed this technique where we were doing her head. We put IV bags around her head.
Yeah.
to get the scanner to tune,
Right.
took the water bags out, scanned just fine.
Right.
Or leave the water bags in for what it's worth. It doesn't really matter. So we were able to scan. And on this 1,000-year-old Peruvian mummy, we saw residual brain. We saw residual intervertebral disc space.
Wow.
We saw diaphragms, like fibrosed diaphragms and abdominal tissue. We were able to see stuff.
Or it was considered diagnosis. Like, could you see a stenosis on the?
I wouldn't say so because it was sort of misshapen. It was all sort of dried and, it's like a grape to a raisin. You lose that surface detail.
Right.
So it really didn't work all that well. I mean, although from our standpoint, it was completely successful. So you do one, word gets out, you do more. So then we did an Egyptian mummy from the Barnum Museum in Connecticut, named Pa'ib. That was 2,000 years old in Egyptian. And they were getting ready to do a preservation. So they wanted to do MRI and CT before the preservation efforts. The problem we have is, so we formed this group called the Bioanthropology Research Institute at Quinnipiac. And we went wherever the mummies were. The problem is we had to borrow local resources. So we had to, if we were going to Seattle, which I'll tell you about in a little bit, we had to use a local scanner in Seattle. And they had to have their own tech because we're not allowed to just go in and scan other people's.
Right.
Not allowed to thug their gear. So the problem is every tech wants to show how good they are. So like our protocols are fabulous. We got these great protocols for brain. We're not scanning a brain. We're scanning a mummy brain. But it's still in the brain. No, it's in the head, but it's not. You have to use totally different techniques. Forget everything you learned about MRI. Right? There is no T1, there's no T2. We actually had to develop a phantom because we weren't sure what the tissue signal we were getting was. So we developed a very interesting phantom. I took 3 vacuum tubes, filled one with 1% dilute gadolinium, one with vegetable oil for fat, and one with distilled water. So now we have a water phantom, a fat phantom, and a gadolinium reference phantom. And based on density measurements of that or intensity measurements, we could sort of approximate what we were looking at. So we came up with this cool phantom. We also came up with one for CT where it was pieces of polyethylene, high density polyethylene, low density polyethylene, polystyrene, and acrylic. And on CT, they mimicked soft tissue, bone, lung, and a couple other things. And we, of course, put them all together in a big pipe, wrapped it in duct tape, and then one of our team got arrested in Mexico for carrying an IED.
Oh gosh.
So yeah. So
How long
Didn't
did
get too
it spend?
custom.
not
with
long.
that, right?
He got out eventually, but he doesn't tell the story. So
Jeez.
it was interesting because explaining that it's a reference phantom for scanning mummies doesn't compute with Border Patrol.
Yeah.
They don't get it.
You're right.
So
It's a tough sell. We're
it
like,
is what it is.
sure, right?
So we proceeded into the 2000s. In the 2000s, we did a lot more mummy work. So there was a guy in Pennsylvania. There was a funeral home in central Pennsylvania that the gentleman that started it emigrated from Germany. And Germany was the first place in the world where formaldehyde embalming was used. They invented formaldehyde. And this was like 1880. So in 1890, he was using it in Pennsylvania. The first ever cases of formaldehyde preservation in the U.S. Until then, they were using arsenic. Arsenic was developed by President Lincoln to bring officers home from the war in better condition. The enlisted men, the soldiers were brought home, they were kind of gooey and decayed. But he wanted better for the officers. So they came up with this formaldehyde technique, this arsenic technique where they injected them with diluted arsenic, and it was the perfect preservative. There's no tissue decay. It kills all bacteria.
Oh wow.
It's also toxic as hell,
Right,
which is why some of these Civil War battlefields you can't visit.
All right.
The Civil War cemeteries, some of them are off limits because of the arsenic content in the ground. So we did this mummy named George Fred. He was...
Did you name him that?
No, that was the name he was assigned. They did not have his real identity, so they gave him this moniker just so they could refer to him with a name because it was disrespectful to just
And
call
then
him.
what time period and area was he from?
So he was probably the late 1890s, one of the earliest formaldehyde mummies in the U.S.
Okay.
And we have images on him that are fantastic. We can see all the tissues. We can see the heart, the ventricles. We can see everything. And again, people say it doesn't work. They're dry. They're preserved. It works just fine if you know what you're doing.
Could you see pathology?
So
Like
in
plaque
one of the other mummies, we could see pathology because the second mummy that we did in that time period was the latest example that we were able to find of arsenic embalming. He was embalmed sometime in the early 1890s with arsenic, or late 1800s with arsenic. So he was one of the last arsenic mummies we were able to find. And he was shot with a shotgun at some point in his career. And there were pellets under the skin, and we were able to see all the little pellets. And you can see them on the post-mortem. You can see them under the skin. His skin is so well preserved. You can see the color of his eyes.
Wow.
That's how good arsenic is. And when you see the pictures, you won't believe it. It's really fabulous. And we did that up in Seattle. And he is actually still there. He's in a museum in Seattle. His name's
Still called George?
Sylvester.
Okay.
George Fred was Pennsylvania. Sylvester was Seattle. And then the mummy stuff quieted down because there's only so many mummies out there that need imaging.
Sure.
So we were doing more wildlife. So a local wildlife rescue group called us one time and said, hey, we have this hawk. The hawk was chasing a rabbit, and I guess they get real focused on their prey, and it flew into the side of a car. When the rabbit went under the car. It broke its neck. And they said, we need to see how bad the damage is. The x-ray says it's pretty bad, but we can't see the cord. So we brought him into the MRI of his neck. Turns out his spinal cord was intact. It was just dinged. Mm-hmm. So they stabilized him, put some braces on him, and let him heal for 6 weeks, whatever it was. And then they released him. He flew away. He was fine. So they brought us other stuff. They brought us a possum that was, one pupil was real big. They thought it had a brain tumor. Turns out it was just a weird possum. They brought us ducks, swans, turtles. We scanned like tremendous amounts of wildlife stuff.
Yeah.
We did an owl. The interesting thing about birds is the way you get them to hold still. If the bird is nocturnal, you turn all the lights in the room on because you want it real bright so the bird goes to sleep.
Yeah.
If the bird is active at daytime, then you turn the lights off so it goes to sleep. So you have to adjust your lighting based on the style of bird you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, they're still immobilized, though, I would imagine.
They're not real immobilized. So interestingly enough, it's hard to position a bird with pads and straps. So I came up with this really harebrained idea to immobilize birds. Took a pair of pantyhose, took the bird by the feet, you stick him in the leg of the pantyhose. It doesn't hurt the bird. It pulls all their feathers down, and it's like a cocoon, so they just sit there and do nothing. They don't know what else to do.
Yeah.
And then when you're done, snip the toe off the pantyhose, push the bird out the other side like a push-up pop.
Right.
Bird's fine.
Did you have to ask your wife to borrow her panties?
No, I bought special pantyhose for that. Yeah, I can't use the wife's pantyhose for that stuff. That was a no-no. Although I did get in trouble for my wife. I borrowed my wife's car, and she went out to use it to pick the kids up at school, and there was a mummy in the back seat.
Oh no.
So I got a frantic phone call saying, "What's going on? There's a mummy in my back seat." So I had to apologize for that one. So we had a rule: the kids weren't allowed to look in the box in the basement that was labeled "Don't look."
Well, if you tell a kid that.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, they were pretty good. We did a
Is
forensic
there a
study
smell with it?
with the mummies,
Yeah.
like earth.
Okay.
Depends.
Yeah.
Most of it.
Like I
there's not
wouldn't go
really-
down in
there's
your
no real-
basement and say it smells
There's no
like
real
mummies.
decay. No, because there's no real decay.
Okay.
They're 1,000 years old.
it's not
The
breaking
decay's
down.
So
already
the
happened.
soft tissue is pretty well intact still?
It depends on how they were preserved.
Right.
So if they're preserved with formaldehyde fixes proteins, but it doesn't fix the fat. So the fat can liquefy over time or turn to soap, saponification. And there's a couple famous soap mummies. There's one at the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, the soap lady. She's completely soap.
Really?
Yeah. And they look like post burns because the soap's real dark and the fat sort of rancifies, gets rancid. And it's really, they're interesting because the anatomy changes, the tissue density changes from inside to outside. So the soap mummies are really kind of cool. So it evolved after doing all these animals. So I hooked up with a friend of mine, Jim Stepino, who you guys know.
Oh yeah, big shout out.
And we started the first veterinary imaging center in the area, Animal Scan.
Nice.
And we were doing just dogs, cats, reptiles, kangaroos, whatever people brought us. We did zoo specimens. We did a red kangaroo from the Lehigh Valley Zoo. We did
At
some
this
reptiles.
point, they're under anesthesia, right?
So the clinical veterinary stuff's always under anesthesia. We didn't use anesthesia for the wildlife stuff because it was tough. It was wildlife rehabilitators. There wasn't often a veterinarian involved because they always run on a very
Was there
low
any
budget.
sedation of any kind?
So we didn't use sedation. We used clever immobilization. That's why the pantyhose, the light versus the dark.
Yeah, yeah.
And it worked really quite well. We were able to get, I think there was only one swan we couldn't get to scan because it wouldn't calm down. But that was the only specimen out of the 100 that we scanned that we couldn't get images on.
What was the biggest animal?
The biggest clinical animal?
Yeah.
The kangaroo or a Great Dane.
Okay.
Well, but you did I guess you did a will fin.
So that was a little later on, but yes, we did on the research side. So the Bioanthropology Research Institute at Quinnipiac was formed for the express purpose of imaging stuff that other people don't image. So they did CTs of paintings, musical instruments from the Barnum Museum, from the Yale Museum the Peabody Museum at Yale, and MRIs of anything they needed an MRI. And so this one woman was doing a research project on, she was developing a new, I'm not sure what it was an embalming agent or a contrast agent, but she wanted to do a couple of horse heads where they inject the contrast agent, and it's a mixture of embalming fluid, gelatin, and hypake, the old oral contrast they used to use for barium swabs.
Wow.
And the embalming fluid fixes the proteins in the blood. The gelatin turns it into basically like silicone, and the hypake makes it visible. So they injected this, they cannulized the horse heads, they injected this, and we got these incredibly high detailed angiograms of this horse's anatomy that will never decay. They never go away.
Right.
Even if the horse head goes away, the vessel tree stays because it's now preserved in gelatin.
Is it pretty similar to what we would see in a human brain? Like, is there a cow?
You know,
Such a smaller brain, right?
The brain
Does
is
a horse have a cow?
the horse brain is actually somewhat big,
Oh, okay.
but if you look at the blood flow, and I'll send you pictures, much of the blood flow goes to the face and the jaw.
Okay.
The nose for smell and the teeth, the mandibles for chewing. That's where the bulk of the blood flow goes.
Right.
And their brains are not real well corticated. So they don't have a huge cortication in their brain, which means they're intelligent animals, but they're not thinking at a high order. So there's not a lot of cortical function going on there.
Upset a lot of people.
No, they're very intelligent. But, looking at their brain, it looks different than a human brain
Right.
in terms of cortication. It depends on what mammals you look at. Other mammals, so we did a tapir. A tapir is like a big pig with a long nose.
Oh, okay.
And they have no cortication whatsoever. Their cerebellums are really well detailed, but their cerebral cortex is smooth. They're not thinking about anything. It's all cerebellum. So eat, make babies, sleep, repeat.
Right.
There's no, hi, how you doing? Maybe I'll go over there and have a flat. No, nothing. There's no thought going on in those eyes. So we did, there's not a lot of research being done or wasn't being done at the time into like cetacean mammal anatomy. There was a sperm whale that washed up on a beach somewhere in the southeast. I'm not sure where. And one of the veterinarians we'd consulted with at the time said, "Can we scan a whale flipper?" I said, "No one's ever scanned a whale flipper. So yes, yes, we can."
Right.
So we got this whale flipper, and it was 9 feet long,
Wow.
4 feet wide. It weighed like 350 pounds. It was huge. So it was too wide for the table, so we had to trim it down a little bit, and it was too long for the table to move.
Right.
So you have to modify the table, right? You have to use the table more creatively. So not even using the table. Like one of the specimens we did at another facility, we made our own tabletop. We took this vendor supplied table out. We put little wooden dowels down in the tracks and put a piece of plywood that was 11 feet long in there. And then we moved the specimen to isocenter, scanned, and then moved it based on markings on the table. So we moved the specimen without having to advance the table and just repeated the scans. So we made our own moving table. So it requires a little bit of flexibility, a little bit of creativity, but you can do some really cool stuff.
Right.
And the whale flippers are fascinating. I'll show you the images. They have, it looks like a human wrist. The arrangement of the carpal bones there's a different number, but they look similar in their arrangement. But the cartilage is different. The cartilage is pentagon shaped, so they're square on the corners. They have flat sides.
Right.
And the reason for that is when they go down 2,000 feet under the ocean, the pressure becomes intense. So round things compress differently than square things. Round things compress, they don't rub together the same way.
Right.
Square things keep that joint, that flat joint, mobile, because whales don't have ballast tanks, right? They get down 2,000 feet, they have to swim their way back up. So if they can't propel with their tail and adjust their trim with their bow planes, they can't get back up, they drown. So the whale flipper has to be flexible at depth. So they've evolved this structure that we see on MRI that shows how that happened.
Wow.
Very cool stuff.
I can't imagine
so
the
cool.
excitement when the picture first pops up.
It's so cool.
Is that a human
It's
hand?
so cool. And if you look at the arrangement of the metacarpals, there are 4 metacarpals, and there's this little stump off the side where a thumb would be.
So they have similar ligaments too?
Yes, extensor and flexors. Yes, on the top, extensors on the top, flexors on the bottom. It looks very much like if you focus on certain areas of it, looks like a human hand. There's a radius and the ulna. They're big. They're short, but they're really kind of big.
Yeah.
And they're very, very cool.
So the flipper was probably the coolest thing you'd see?
The coolest one I've seen, I think, was we did an elephant foot.
Oh.
So I've seen those, and those look like an actual human foot.
They do.
Off of sagittal, at least.
Yeah, off a sagittal. So they do a lot of x-rays of elephant feet, but there was very few MRIs done. In fact, I can't think of any that were done before. I couldn't find a published record of any of them before we did it. The elephant in question was at an East Coast zoo and died at age 53. Elephants, even in captivity, should live into their 70s. So they were going to do a necropsy to find out what this elephant succumbed to. And it turns out it was some bacterial infection they didn't know about. But whatever it was, they said, while we have this animal, we're going to be sectioning certain parts for imaging study. Somebody wanted to do CAT scan of the trunk.
Right.
I said, well, we'll do that. We'll do the MRI. No, we've already promised it to someone else. So I thought that would have been kind of cool.
Oh man, that was so.
So we wound up getting the foot. So they brought us this elephant foot just below the knee in a garbage can, and they'd filled it with water and put it in the deep freezer. I don't know why they did this, but it was frozen solid. So we had to thaw it out. So we let it thaw for 7 days, and we got all the ice off, and it seemed to normalize. The temperature gun said it was more close to ambient room temperature. So we scanned it in the normal fashion. CT, X-rays, MRI, we did everything. If we have a specimen, we do everything.
Right.
Anything we possibly can do. And the specimen looks fantastic. The extensor tendons, the deep digital flexor tendons,
Right.
the carpal bones. The big thing that you notice the difference is on the bottom, the fat pad on the bottom of the foot is massive
Yeah.
because it has to dissipate a tremendous amount of weight.
Right.
But there was this signal void in the center. There was this little black area we couldn't figure out. Turns out it was still a little frozen in the center. So ice has a shorter T1, so we had to wait for the specimen to thaw so the T1 would normalize.
Right.
And is that a quick conclusion to come to? Or did you guys...
It takes a second. So why is the signal void there? Is it dielectric effect? Is it something else? But since the rest of the tissue had normal signal, we concluded that it was sort of oval shaped and it was protected by a lot of fat. We presumed that it was just temperature gradient. And another 48 hours in room temperature, and it went away. So we were right. It was just frozen partially. And, it's a known fact that ice is a short T1. If you do an MRI of a glass of ice water, the cubes look different than the water.
Yeah.
So it's the same concept.
It's funny. I kind of want to do that. I've never seen it.
Oh, you never done that?
No, never done that.
Do that all the time. Do experiment for the students. We scanned ice water. We scanned watermelons. We scanned sandwiches.
Oh man.
Scanned turkeys.
We were scanning some fruit recently.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got a new scanner.
Yeah, we got a new 7T, so we're kind of playing with that.
Scan a mango.
Okay.
True sagittal mango. Images are incredible.
Yeah, I would imagine. Pineapple would look pretty cool too.
Pineapples are cool. Corn's cool.
Yeah.
Flower buds that haven't opened yet are really cool when they're just getting ready to open.
Oh. That's interesting.
So then modern day, what are you scanning nowadays?
So nowadays,
Forensics, yeah.
the Bioanthropology Research Institute has sort of dropped off a little bit. The most recent mummy that we did was 2015, I think, or 16, and it was a very interesting mummy. So there was an excavation happening at a church in Queens or Brooklyn, one of the boroughs, but it wasn't Manhattan. And they were doing some backhoe work to excavate the foundation for a new church extension. And they came across an old iron coffin. And they damaged it with the lids. Right. So they called the medical examiner, like you do. The medical examiner came over, they took the lid off, and the medical examiner freaked out because the body was covered with smallpox.
Wow.
So they put up this big tent, called the CDC. The CDC came out and took swabs, biopsies, and everything else. And they said, no active virus. This is safe. So because it was an antique body of historical significance, instead of the medical examiner, it went to the state anthropologist. State anthropologist is someone we'd worked with in the past. And he said, opportunity, let's see if we can scan this body. Mm-hmm. So we negotiated with the body's custodians, which was the church at the time. And they agreed to let us take it to an imaging center relatively close to where it was housed. and do some MR and CT and some X-rays. And we did. The last outbreak of smallpox in the U.S. was 1949.
Right.
CT was invented in 71, MRI 80s. So imaging of smallpox has never happened.
Right.
So we have the only data sets in existence of MRI and CT of smallpox.
Wow.
And we can see pox on the brain and on the internal organs. It wasn't just on the
What
skin.
does it look like?
Little
Like
little blibs.
hyperdensities.
I mean, it's old. The body's 100 years old. So
So the body was also well preserved?
it was because it was a cast iron coffin. And they used a rim of wax so that the top part met the bottom part and sealed it. It was hermetically sealed. There was no decay whatsoever. She looked incredible
I was going to say, how would they immediately know about this?
because she was very well preserved. You could see them on her skin.
Mm.
And that was in Queens, you said?
Queens or Brooklyn, one of the boroughs.
That
I
probably
don't
made like national news.
No, it didn't. They kept that kind of quiet.
Did they?
Yeah. I'm going to say, hey, oh, by the way, we found smallpox.
Right.
Okay.
You know, it's not the kind of thing you brag about. But once it was, and plus there's the familial component to it. I mean, the family has a right to privacy.
Right.
Just because we don't know who she is doesn't mean we don't respect her privacy and treat her with dignity.
Right.
They're still humans.
Did they date her? Like, not literally?
So the dating took place from a couple of things. They were able to date her based on the type of buttons that were on her gown,
Okay.
and the comb in her hair. The comb in her hair was hand carved from turtle shell. So they said probably late 1800s based on the buttons. The button holes in the buttons were hand twisted,
Right.
so they were a little irregular. So they said probably mid to late 1800s.
Upper class person sounds like, huh?
They
Pretty wealthy.
think she was actually, from what they were able to find, church records said she was probably someone of lower income, but the church took up a donation because of the smallpox and upgraded her to cast iron coffin for infection control purposes.
Okay. Okay.
But again, some of it is apocryphal. We're not sure exactly the facts because records are spotty. Records get thrown away.
Right.
Records from 100 years ago, unless they're stored in a records depository,
Right.
become aged.
Well, and then also in an effort to preserve that body, like they'd probably keep the clothes on, everything.
She was fully dressed, shoes, hair made up with curled with a comb in it, like a nice comb. She was very nice. Now, once the cast iron coffin was broken, decay started, and the decay process is pretty quick in a body that old. There's a lot of pent up energy going on.
So they didn't do anything to like
They
prolong that
they weren't able to do anything because they felt that to try and embalm her at the time would have been too invasive.
What about just freezing her?
They declined
Flash
that.
freeze or something.
So they thought about it, but then ultimately her intended fate was to go back into the ground. She was going to be repatriated back into the ground in a cemetery in the neighborhood where she was from, allegedly. So the custodians opted to not stop the process, let her age naturally post-mortem and go into the ground at that point.
And as far as images go, is that probably one of the best you've seen when it comes to mummy or mummified?
It was
Newer
pretty
technology.
good because there was no preservatives used. There was no organs removed, so we can see liver, we can see kidneys, we can see spleen.
Oh, nice.
They're better on CT because MRI relies on mobile protons.
Right.
So the more mobile protons you have, the more water, the better your pictures are. So it definitely takes a little getting used to looking at the images. They look different, but
It's
it
great.
doesn't mean it's not useful, right?
Right,
The details are what give you the true value there.
So nowadays, so that was back in 2015. Have you done anything?
So we've had some things come up since then. I've sort of declined a couple of projects. There was one project they wanted us to do, a Bolivian mummy, I believe, but they wanted it done in Bolivia. So
You don't like to travel?
I do like to travel, but it was rural Bolivia. They weren't going to be able to get an MRI or a CT. It was just going to be an X-ray project, and use the right tool for the right job. I don't do X-ray.
Right.
I went to X-ray school, but I haven't really practiced X-ray since, other than on specimens that we wanted X-ray, and I was the guy who was there.
Yeah.
We're not concerned about over penetrating or over radiographing or over radiating because they're specimens. But there's better people for the job than me.
Have
for
you
that.
traveled internationally in
For
scanning?
mummy stuff? No. We did several teams that have gone to South America, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, in Mexico. There's a place called Museo de los Mummies, the Mummy Museum.
Right.
And basically, if you had enough money, you weren't buried. You were preserved and put on display in this museum. And as long as you paid your storage fee, you were able to be in perpetuity in the museum. If you didn't pay your storage fee, then you were buried.
Right.
You just hear about them always finding things in permafrost, and it's usually more northern, like Mongolia, Alaska. Have you seen?
Well, the permafrost stuff is real cool because if you freeze fast enough, it preserves everything. Like
Right.
the last mastodon baby they found, they were able to tell what kind of berries it was eating because the color was still in the berries in the baby's stomach.
It's crazy.
It's just fascinating stuff. And the
Right.
bog mummies are real interesting.
Yeah.
But think about, so we've done a couple different mummies from South America that had different methods of preservation. Some, remove organs and inject stuff or bathe them, anoint them with stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Some just put them in the fetal position, wrap them in cloth and put them in a hole in the wall in a cave. So they preserve by the cool, damp environment, the cool, dry environment in a cave, but the minerals from the soil leach in. So what's the problems with minerals in MRI, right? The minerals could contain ferric oxides or metallic pigments.
Right.
Metallic oxides, and they can distort the image.
Right.
So it's different every time. There's no one standard protocol. It's
Right.
You got to try a whole spectrum of things to find what works.
I've seen a lot of episodes of CSI, but I've yet to see them use an MRI scanner for anything. Do you see there being any type of forensic need for MRI still in law enforcement?
So postmortem MRI has gotten more popular. There's a big group in Israel that does it because the Israelis have a different way of handling a body post-death.
Mm-hmm.
The more orthodox Israelis don't like autopsy. They're religiously opposed to autopsy, so they will do postmortem imaging on adults and children. There's some groups in Europe that are doing the same things.
Right.
There's groups in U.S. that use it occasionally. Postmortem MRI has become a thing.
And has it become more reliable in terms of like legalities?
I don't know. I haven't checked on that lately. I think at this point it's probably more reliable that would be accepted as evidence in court. It would depend on the circumstance.
Do you think it's more based because of how we do our whole, Fourier transformation, image reconstruction is why it's not really, solid proof? Or not necessarily?
I think the
not quantitative,
database of knowledge has gotten such that we know what we're looking at these days.
Okay.
In 1990, in 1988, 1987, we know what we were looking at. We thought we knew what we were looking at, but we learned more every day. Like there was always new stuff coming in.
Right.
Because the total amount of MRIs done in 1985 was what? 5,000? 7,000? Now we're doing what? Several million a year? So the knowledge base has gotten much more experienced and much more evolved. So we just simply have a higher confidence level in what we're seeing. It's become an expert system at this point.
Right.
Other than like travel purposes, have you ever turned down an opportunity to scan something unusual just for?
Never, right? Never.
If I have access to a scanner, I'll scan anything. Yeah, I don't turn down anything. I mean, think about how who was it? Paul Latimer at SUNY New York, SUNY Downstate.
Yeah.
He used to scan when he developed his techniques. He was going digging clams on the beach with his daughter and getting peppers at the farmer's market. That's how he developed some of the techniques that we use today.
Right.
So there's a long history of scanning stuff.
Right.
Yeah. You don't really think about it. I used to play with scanning or doing X-rays or different
Sure.
crazy things, but
I have an X-ray on my wall with sand dollar.
that'd be a good one. I have one
Right.
with Snell.
Yeah.
Even a box of cereal was kind of cool.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
I remember when I was an X-ray student, we used to X-ray candy baskets for the kids at trick or treat
Oh, nice. Oh, yeah, because
to look for needles.
needles.
Back then, it was the needle scares.
I used to be
did that
so
ever happen?
mad
Razor
at my
blades?
mom. That delayed my candy delivery for like a day.
Yeah,
I
because
used to
they'd
be
be
so
like, well, we have
upset.
to go through your candy. And
Yeah.
I thought they had a alternative mode or purpose.
Someone I know very well
They wanted to
used to take the Butterfingers out of her kids' candy buckets because she said they had booze in them.
Not the
She
Butterfingers.
loved the Butterfingers. She wanted the Butterfingers.
Oh, that's a good move.
I'm not gonna lie. I take all the gummy bears out of my kids.
Dude.
There you
I
go.
mean, why not?
Oh, that's
It's
great.
evolution. Things change over time. You learn
Well, speaking of evolution, there's obviously been an evolution of your career. So nowadays, though, you're working for Embrace. What else are you doing?
So I work for Embrace now for Aspect Imaging full-time as the Director of Training and Education. So as we saw in an earlier podcast, we make the 1 Tesla neonatal scanner, and my job is to train customers how to use that safely and get the most out of that scanner. And then collateral to that, I teach online. I teach generally 15 to 20 credits a year, the MR physics, procedures, safety, stuff like that.
Nice.
And that's it. Other than that, I work from home.
And so how would somebody get a hold of you if they wanted to? Like, do you want to shout out any kind of website or?
Yeah,
Do you
CSI
have
or
an
somebody
IG?
wants to reach out to you.
I don't have an IG. I don't have anything. I'm on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn. Or my email is Google me. I have email.
And you're one of the safety experts, right? On for MRI safety.
Oh, for MR safety? Yes.
Okay.
And I do a lot of safety consulting work from time to time for safety audits. So, sites that are having, so it's interesting. If you have a problem in MRI, you have a problem.
Right.
If you have a problem one year and the next year and the next year, you have a pattern.
Oh, yeah.
And the pattern's the problem. Because, well, no one was injured, but how long do you have to wait till someone gets injured to solve your problems?
Oh, yeah.
And
Great question.
it's interesting because with the way the lawsuits have evolved and the attorneys have evolved, every attorney who does medical malpractice knows about the ACR manual on safety. And if you're not following it, your defense is either I didn't know about it, in which case you're incompetent,
Right.
or it's not mandatory. It says it's suggested,
Right.
in which case you're naive. Either way, the judgment goes way up because that is the de facto standard of care in our industry.
Yeah. And they just came out with a new manual, right?
Just came out, like last week, early this week.
Yeah.
Have you had a chance to read it?
I started thumbing through it. It's a long
It's
one.
a big one.
140.
Right.
Yeah, it's a cat killer.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Was there anything we've missed?
Don't think we've asked them the question that we asked everybody.
Oh,
I'm
the
gonna ask
question.
you the question.
The question.
Well, so it sounds like you've had a fun career. What would you say has been the most satisfying or fulfilling moment in this long career of yours?
Oh, I couldn't pin it down to one thing.
But you have to, though.
Doing
You're in front
babies
of a
is always
camera.
satisfying because it makes a difference in the course of care for a baby.
Right.
Okay.
That's a great answer.
Doing veterinary is fascinating and rewarding because you take a dog that is looking at end of life and you determine based on the images that it's got time left. They wake up, they lick your face.
Right.
Patients don't generally wake up and lick your face in MRI, so it's a nice thing.
Do you like to have your face lit?
From a dog? Yeah, sure. Patient? No.
Right.
There's boundaries. There's it's
Right.
Well, I think that's pretty much it, right?
Yeah, for anyone out there that's kind of looking to get into research or like even veterinarian scanning, like what would you recommend for them?
well, there's now probably 100 veterinary centers across the world, across the U.S. probably. The world's probably higher. So clinical veterinary MRI is a thing.
Right.
Google veterinary MRI, find one of those centers near you and see if they're hiring and they're looking for part-time work. You want to get into something else? Right now in 2024 is a great time for MR techs.
Right.
There's tremendous amounts of jobs out there. There's huge applications opportunities. The vendors are looking for more people.
Right.
If you've got a lot of experience, the R&D teams are looking for clinical liaisons and clinical science people. It's almost impossible not to get a job in MRI these days.
Right.
Well, if you're looking for a tech in Arizona for your next fun mummy project, I'm your guy.
If I get a mummy in Arizona, you guys will be my first phone call.
I don't know how well that sun is going to preserve anything, but
It ages everything quickly.
right. Exactly.
Well, thank you, John.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
No, thanks for having me.
It's been a fun conversation. Appreciate you. We've been waiting to get you on the podcast for a while now.
Yeah.
You trapped me.
Now we got to get you to do karaoke.
Stay tuned for that.
Never going to happen.
Well, I think that's pretty much it, Reggie.
Yes, thanks to everyone for watching week after week. Thanks for subscribing. If you haven't subscribed, make sure you do hit that like button and subscribe. We really appreciate all the support. Katie?
Great. This was awesome. One of my top ones that
Thank you.
I've enjoyed. Yeah.
That's Zone 3 Podcast.
We are out.